Hello, channel partners. My name is Ekenna Anya-Gafu. I'm the Director of Planning at Bay Street Capital. You'll be hearing from me and William Huston today, founder of Bay Street Capital. Today, we're going to be addressing a fiduciary's role amid a crisis. We saw what happened last year with coronavirus, but there's more with that meets the eye. And today we're going to be covering that. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for channel partners for having us. Today, when we dive into this, we're going to be talking a little bit about Bay Street, who we are as a firm, and what we're doing in our space. We'll also be talking about understanding your role as a fiduciary and what you can do about it. I'd like to introduce Will Huston now, founder of Bay Street, to tell you about where we started from and who we are.
Great. Thanks everyone again for joining. And, we want to just start out by explaining who we are and how we got to where we are as fiduciaries in this space and why everyone viewing should care. So a bit of background, we started in 2008 supporting the thrift savings plan. We work with a lot of major insurance companies, and the thrift savings plan is the largest retirement plan. So there's $550 billion in that plan. And we served as consultants for 10 years before deciding that we would enter in to the space as advisors that were fiduciaries. And there is a difference between a fiduciary and a broker, which we'll touch on a bit later. In 2018, one of those insurance companies recommended us to a robo-advisor. Some of you might be familiar with the term. It's essentially a computer that will provide a recommendation as opposed to an individual. So in 2018, robo-advisors were really picking up steam, and we were supporting one of those robo-advisors that went from a startup in the Bay Area to holding $500 million in assets. And when that happened, we decided it was time for us to register as a firm. And so in 2019, we started our strategy. It's called the lens of history. So we invest in companies that through the lens of history are going to outperform. We had no idea in 2020 that, anything would happen as did anyone else. But fortunately, we were able to kind of prove our investment thesis. And today, we currently are fiduciaries for about 86 million in assets. So now let's pop into what it actually means to be a fiduciary and how you should be looking at your own individual retirement account. And if you are in a role where you are serving as a fiduciary to the plan for your participants, some things that you should do to make sure that the plan is in good order. Great. So now we're taking a look at the importance of understanding how the ins and outs of your retirement plan works. The first thing we're going to touch on are just a couple of data points. So as you can see here, about 90 million Americans participate in a 401k. The total balance for those accounts is a staggering 6 trillion in assets. And in terms of employers, most employers match these plans. So 51% of employers in the US actually match and contribute to your plan. Now, a lot of people, although they are participating, don't realize how the fees work in these plans. The fees are governed by something called ERISA law. And the 401k space is full of lawsuits that are poorly governed because the plans are supposed to be designed in a way that are in the best interest of your participants. So today we want to talk to some of those points that you should be aware of to understand, is this plan actually in my best interest? The things that would cause concern would be things like concessions, which are basically payments for services, fees, and then commissions that are either soft dollar fees or commissions where someone is being compensated to make a recommendation. So scrolling down, we're going to let Ekenna speak to how some of these issues show up in plans.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that, Will. And something that, obviously you can see the title hide and seek. But when we think of fees, there's really two types of fees. There are external fees and internal fees. And by that, we mean that the external fees are the fees that you very much see on paper. Now, the average participant isn't necessarily seeing these fees. And this is why the stat of when you look at 92% have no clue what they pay in fees. Even more alarming than that is 71% of all participants, at least taken for the survey, actually don't understand that there are any fees applied. Down here under the retirement savings and services, it lists some of the different fees from communication expenses, bookkeeping expenses, administrative expenses, and so on and so forth. However, the internal fees is something that we really need to keep an eye on. And the reason for this is often the person who's in charge of the plan, they're not necessarily coming from a finance background. And so their main priority is to make sure that the plan is working, that the deductions are happening correctly, and it makes sense, right? That's what's happening. But the internal fees, especially the investment expenses, is something that you really do need to take a look at, because oftentimes, if the firm isn't large enough, they're not getting pricing power. We'll talk about that a little later. But when they're not large enough, you're essentially sometimes getting a not fair price for the funds that they're offering. And so we will take a look of how does that actually affect the plan, your growth, and the overall performance of your 401k.
Great. So let's talk about how these fees add up and what it actually costs. So looking here, I think the easiest way to look at this is how it costs over the lifetime of your account, as in once you're all said and done contributing to your 401k. Most people think of this in terms of what's my final balance. The way we're looking at this is alongside that final balance, how much have you actually paid in fees of investment performance? So we have two simple examples, someone who is making $30,000 a year, then another individual that is making $90,000 a year. And as you hear, for someone who contributes to their plan and they save 5% of their paycheck, they would pay a whopping $154,000 in fees just to have a 401k. Mind you, this was 71% of participants not even realizing that there are fees in their plan. For a higher income earner, someone in the $90,000 range, they're paying over $270,000 in fees if they're contributing at that same 5% contribution limit. Now, everyone has heard of concessions. What we're pointing out is what actually happens and why they're not good, because you can actually save in your plan if you can make sure that participants are not being charged these additional fees. Now, a lot of times it depends on the types of funds that you select. So, mutual funds have lots of different fee structures that are a little too broad for the conversation today. All that to say, looking for the right lineup of funds has a lot to do with the overall experience for the participants. So to ensure that participants have a positive experience when participating in this plan, the most important thing to do is to have an understanding of how the fees in the mutual funds or ETF work, so that once those funds are added to the lineup, it's very clear in terms of total cost what it's going to take for participants to access those funds.
As I mentioned earlier, that essentially when we look at what type of plans are there, at the $20 million mark, that's when we start to assume that the firm itself starts to have some price negotiation and some weight behind them. Unfortunately, what we noticed is from this graphic, 93% of all firms making up most of America's companies are actually below this $20 million threshold. Why does that matter? And the reason, quite frankly, why this matters is when you don't have pricing negotiation power, you're essentially subject to whatever they give you. And what we'll notice here is that there is one major insurance company, we won't name them, that was offering an S&P 500 index fund for 1.68% annually. Now, you may say, well, why does that matter? 1.68 compared to the 0.05% average is a 297% markup. Where does that additional money go? It generally goes to a corporate relationship or to some type of backdoor payment. And so because of that, we like to point this out as this is something that you can bring up to your 401k provider and say, hey, why is this the case? Once again, if you're under the $20 million mark, maybe they don't give you a break. But by bringing it up, you now alert them that you're aware of what's going on in your 401k. And what we've seen in the past is generally that's when people start to get favorable prices. Thank you. If you scroll down. All right, right there. And the easiest way to put this as well is tiny fees make a difference. Although your 401k may say, hey, it's only $12 a person or whatever that may look like, those small fees, especially over the course of someone's career, really does actually take a divot into their overall financial situation. As we saw earlier, 30% of your balance is lost to fees. And so being a fiduciary and being someone who's aware of this really can put your participants in a better position, not now, but also in the future. Will?
Great. And so last we can just touch on what are some of the things that we can do about it. The first is to just take a look at your plan. All plans have to have a document called a fee disclosure agreement. And in that, even if you can't see it explicitly when you log into your account, they will have to disclose what you're paying in fees. Anytime you see a fund that has upwards of 1% in terms of a net expense ratio, you should start to ask why that particular fund was selected, especially when comparing it to the peer group and other funds that include the same companies at a lower cost. The next thing to do once you take a look at the plan and examine the ins and outs of it is to work alongside HR. Even if someone is a CFO or head of benefits, at the end of the day, ERISA law is its own can of worms, and it requires someone who is working with these 401ks day in and day out. So often, someone in HR isn't necessarily as familiar as you would think in terms of how do these plans actually work from a fee standpoint. And the reason for that is because a lot of the fees are actually coming out of the participant's account. It's not being paid directly by the employer. These are fees coming out of the participant's own balances. And the third thing is to act on that. And we would recommend acting alongside an advisor that you've done your own due diligence on. And when we use the term advisor, I mean a investment firm that serves as an advisor to your retirement account. And with that, regardless of the total balance of the account, you would be able to introduce a fund lineup that is low cost. And with those low costs, be able to save on the total cost as you mature through and complete saving for your retirement, end up with more. And, the last piece that we'll touch on is, again, even 1% in fees can save you over 10 years of extra retirement income. So if you're able to find even 1% more than you should be paying or that you can be paying to have the same type of quality plan administered, that would translate to 10 years of additional retirement income for all of the participants in the organization. So thank you everyone for popping in. I hope that after reviewing some of the fee side of how these plans work, it gets you thinking about some other things that you can do to address making sure that your plan is handled in a way that's in the best interest of your participants. One thing that we found at Bay Street is that when you design a plan like this from a performance standpoint and from a fee standpoint, you end up with a more diverse plan. And when I use the term diverse, what I mean is in terms of ownership of the fund managers that are in that plan. So at Bay Street, we advocate for diverse and emerging fund managers. And what that means is when we're designing the lineup of the funds that are in a retirement account, we're not just looking at, how long they've been in existence or, what their total asset size are. We're looking at how have they performed in their peer group. And the great thing about designing a plan from a performance standpoint is you end up with fund managers and fund owners that are people of color, that are women-led, that are women-owned. And typically what we find is most organizations aren't aware that the majority of their 401k from a diversity standpoint, unfortunately, does not reflect that. It's typically all one type of company that's an option or one type of white male manager. So thanks again for popping on. You see our information here, and Ekenna, thanks again for setting this up for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And Will, I appreciate you being a part of this. But I really am appreciative of channel partners for inviting Bay Street for us to bring more awareness to the 401k and really trying to bring some education around it as well. And I think this opportunity is great for us as well. Thank you again for having us. Very appreciative and take care.